My butcher suckers for punishment. Welcome to part two of Memoirs of an Irish Pirate Radio DJ, starring myself, Mark Manning, the DJ that never was. Today I want to talk about the two super pirate stations that arrived on the Irish shores from early 80s through to the mid 80s. They were like nothing else anybody had ever heard. The first one was Sunshine Radio and the second was Radio Nova. Both those names to this day continue on, although other management are now involved, and Irish management, etc. Don't know if it says a lot for our originality as a nation, but that said, perhaps it's a tip of the hat to these two great stations. Sunshine 539 AM came on air sometime around 1980. As a school kid, I was listening to them. They sounded amazing. They were slick, essentially. You could tell from their jingles to their no-nonsense links and their general commercial content. They were good. They weren't immune, however, to my many demo tapes I would send out to people, pathetic little cassettes. And this one in particular I sent to them featured a really bad Frank Spencer impression, who was this guy played by Michael Crawford. Many of you will remember, Betty. And I thought it would be very original to do a demo with some impersonations on it. Misguided youth and all as I was. But perhaps it was also the arrogance of youth that I had the audacity to actually, send them a tape. And they rang me and said, why don't you come in and meet us for breakfast? School kid. And I did. I ended up in the Sands Hotel in Portmarnock they were operating out of and continued to. And all as I can say is I was in the presence of three amazing individuals insofar as certainly radio was concerned. But also they were possibly the most ambitious people I'd ever met. And even at that age, I could tell these guys were different. They didn't sound like the pirates and the so-called management of pirate radio stations I knew of. They were businessmen. They had an elan about them, composure, and they knew what they were doing, because they'd been through the whole pirate thing on Caroline and Radio London and stations off the coast of Holland, etc. They knew their craft. In summary, there were three kings. Robbie Robinson, also known as Robbie Dale on air, formerly the Admiral at Radio Caroline, known as was Chris Carey, who was known as Spangles Muldoon on Radio Caroline. And then you had Tony Allen, the voice, Get Into Guinness Light, who was a kind of verbal gunslinger for hire. He had an amazing voice and was constantly in demand for very high-paid voiceovers. But he was also a psychopath, and both he and Mr. Carey have now passed away, so to a point I'll be careful to not speak ill of the dead. To a point. I'll tell it like it was. But more than anything, I felt their energy. They were setting up here. They were out to make money. They were out to garner listenership. And they managed to achieve both in a very short space of time. During the meeting, Tony got carried away and said, hey, kid. I became known as Kid. You could make a fortune, with leather jackets, advertising, those kind of things, and perhaps commanding, if you get it right, of course. If you get it right, kid, you'll make a fortune on, personal appearances. And my head was spinning at the time, boys and girls. And Chris Carey quickly brought me back down to earth by saying, actually, you could make a fortune advertising spot cream. Because I was riddled with acne at the time. It got a great hoot of laughter, but it crushed me at the same time. Subsequently, I got a call to come in and see them. Perhaps they'd put me on air, but they would certainly show me the studio setup. I arrived up there. In the background of all of this, something had been going on I wasn't aware of, which may explain, although I shouldn't make excuses for people's atrocious behaviour, which may explain Tony Allen's mindset on that particular day. What had happened was they had a beautiful broadcasting mast of about 18 foot high or 20 foot high, and it had been pulled down at some stage, so they'd been off air. Guess who we all reckoned had pulled it down? Eamon Cook of Radio Dublin. Everybody suspected there was no way that he was going to have Brits coming over here. How upstreppers of them thinking they could take a bit of air turf. Essentially, we all reckoned it was him. So those boys at the time, unbeknownst to me, were probably on alert and a bit rattled. Certainly Chris Carey soon afterwards, like a lot of bullies, he was a man-child, kind of shat his pants and thought the IRA were after him and sending him a message, basically. So he hightailed it. It wouldn't be the first time in his life. He did a disappearing act, went off. He was, of course, to return and form Nova. And Robbie, being an ex-squaddy, wasn't going to be easily scared off by anybody. So, like the good admiral he was, he stuck with the ship. And Tony Allen, I was left with showing me the studio. On air was a beautiful girl called Manon Christie. I think she might have been Robbie's daughter. I made the mistake, and possibly I was too over-familiar, but as I said, my head was spinning at the time with radio dreams of when she was playing a song. I went in to say hello and introduce myself. Well, if I did, bad move, because Tony Allen, like that, turned. I've never seen it before or since. It was frightening. He laid into me, not physically. He threatened that he was going to kick the shit out of me. As karma would have it, later on, someone known to me, another radio person, kicked the latent excrement out of him. But that's another story. But at the time it was frightening because, bear in mind, I was only a teenager, and he let me have it, and his eyes were laser beaming into me, and he effed and he blinded me. And I was scared for my own safety. Eventually he calmed down, took me downstairs, said, "Let's have a drink, kid." And there were two guys down there who were visiting over from Holland, middle-aged chaps, and I knew they were laughing at me and talking about me and insulting me in Dutch, because Tony was fluent at Dutch. That was the end of that involvement. That was 1981. Between the jigs and the reels, in the interim years, I got employed with a top 500 company, started to make some good money and drive some company cars and get some foreign holidays and have a life. But the radio bug, as a lot of people will tell you, never goes away. And one day around late 85, early 86, again I rang Robbie. "Any gigs going?" Robbie said, "You may have called at an opportune time, young Mark." And I found myself on air for many subsequent weekends, lots and lots of weekends, and being called in to cover for people as well. Lots of people passed through that porta cabin that came on to establish themselves in Irish radio and broadcasting. People like Martin King, Declan Meehan, who I know, he's now on the East Coast. The great Declan Meehan, Nails Mahoney, you're out there, I know. Is it Brian's your real name? Who else can I think of? There were two really sound jocks. One was David Dennehy and Mark Byrne. Mark went on to be a pilot, like my own brother actually was piloting for Emirates, flying Airbus 380s until quite recently. Someone else went on from radio as well to be a pilot. It might have been Barry Lang. I know he's a friend of my brother's. Was he's 2FM? Anyway, I digress. A point was reached where Chris Carey came back. He smelt the money essentially, because he was always motivated by things like Rolls Royce with personalised number plates, and he formed Nova, and Nova was ultra successful. Essentially he was just ripping off a format from the likes of Kiss FM in LA and applying it here. But to give him his due, he was very technical as well. He had a lot of very expensive equipment and he knew how to use it. So Nova came on the air. It began to kick Sunshine's arse a bit, insofar as Nova possibly had as much as 60% of the market. And at that point, Robbie decided to employ a radio doctor called Bill Cunningham, who was a charismatic character, rangy in appearance. He was 46 years of age when I knew him. He has passed away as well, I believe, as a result of a car accident. some years back. Long blonde, straggly hair, Mr. Rock and Roll himself. He was going to change things, and he did. We were summoned to a meeting in the Porta cabin, and he told us it was going to be a different station, and he was going to engineer things so that we would sound completely different. He, in his own words, wanted the listener to believe they were tuning in not to a radio station but to a party. There's a party going on in Sunshine Radio. He also had little kind of gimmicky, kind of Richard Branson-y things, gimmicks if you like, that were good for business in terms of increasing the listenership and and distinguishing us. He wanted the news on at 10 to the hour and 20 past the hour. Might have been vice versa, but not on the hour. And he also introduced things like the Sunshine 101 Hot Hits formula. I won't say he exclusively was responsible for that. It was probably in collaboration, but definitely the atmosphere he created would have led to the Hot Hits, the big kahuna competition where you could win all kinds of everything and get services for a year or so. And then there was, I listened to the red hot sound of Sunshine 101 as well, when if you picked up your phone, you would possibly win yourself $5,000 or thereabouts. I distinctly remember songs through the summer of '86. I played the likes of, what was it? My favourite waste of time. Was it some guy, David Owen or someone like that, or Paul Owen? I have those soundtracks in my head. The setup itself within that station was, there was no more decks like in the old days. You had carts. This was before PCs. Carts were quite sexy. You'd slap them in here. Technically, there was a chap, I think his name was Gibney. He may have passed away recently. He was very, very good. He was the techies, like, they were cool guys, but they weren't on air. There was a chap called Colin Russell as well. I think he was Canadian, and he had a very no-nonsense approach. I was on air one night, and there was a storm on, and I said, hey, we've strapped Mr. Robinson to the top of the mast, and we've put a skillet on his head to see if we can accentuate our signal, or whatever it was, something really inane like that, typical me. But he came into the studio and he told me, Mark, don't speak about the storm. People don't want to know about the storm. So you were dealing with all kinds of everything. But ultimately, they were professional. Newsreaders of note as well would have been Susan Jackson, went on to RTE as it did, Anne Casson, and they were lovely, quiet ladies. I remember so much of that time. Well, folks, that's pretty much it. In time, Robbie cozied up to Fianna Fáil, which was a bad move, in the hope that would get him granted a commercial licence. I may be paraphrasing that. There might have been more involvement in it. But as we know, politics in Ireland and Gombeanism at that time were rife. Not a lot has really changed, I suppose. But it didn't happen, and the station closed. Chris Carey being jammed by RTE on the one hand and harangued on the other by the likes of the journalist unions, he eventually fled for the hills, but his entrepreneurial skills continued. But he fell foul of Rupert Murdoch and became a convicted criminal for essentially fraud. I think it was something to do with trying to sell on the decoded cards for Sky or something like that. Anyway, he got caught and he did time, only to walk out of a private prison, I think, later on. Where are we? That's it, really. Too much talk. We need some clutter free, says you. Okay, goodbye and thank you for your time.